Why do you think now this concept of resiliency is so important?
We're in an era where hurricanes are rapidly intensifying. We may not have 3 days. New capabilities with small sat, CubeSat capabilities that are providing some of these measurements in ways that we never envisioned.
What types of advanced technologies or emerging weather tech right now are you most excited about? Thank you so much, Dr. Shepard, for joining us today, live from AMS.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to chat about. I'm a weather geek, so I'm happy to talk anytime, any place about weather and the advances in technology.
We're glad to hear it, absolutely. So just to kind of start out, reviewed your profile, obviously, you're well known, but I have to remind the crowd of who we're talking to today. So yeah, we have Dr. Marshall Shepard with us today. So honored to be chatting with you. Former AMS president, distinguished professor at the University of Georgia. You are a member of the National Academy of Engineering, National Academy of Sciences, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, among many other accolades.
Yeah, I stay busy and don't sleep.
If you sleep, yeah. I don't know
I really
how you
do, actually.
So needless to say, your work spans a number of different sectors, a ton of experience, and so excited to have you here talking about a topic which is very close to you, I'm sure, which is building universal resilience in the face of increasing volatility of weather. So to start out, I'd like to talk about democratizing all of this. So we know that extreme weather is getting increasingly worse and it's impacting different communities differently.
Sure.
And so I'm curious from your perspective, how do we ensure that both the urban community as well as elsewhere globally are receiving the benefits of this advanced technology, especially underserved regions?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having this conversation. As we published in the National Academies back in 2016 and are updating that, we know that extreme weather is changing in terms of both its frequency and its intensity. That's not a debate. That's not my opinion. That's what the data is telling us. That's what the Earth is telling us. Mm-hmm. And so what we know is that there's a resiliency gap in terms of our infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, our data centers, and so forth. But there's also a people weather gap as well, because these events, though they are exposed to everyone, certain communities are particularly vulnerable, at risk from a hurricane, from a power outage, and so forth. So it's important that we understand that, and we have a sort of an all-inclusive approach to how we think about not just improving our understanding of the science, but understanding that those impacts spread across all facets of our communities, but that some are disproportionately at greater risk.
Exactly. And we know it's not just sheer human willpower. Technology is a big part of this. What types of advanced technologies or emerging weather tech right now are you most excited about that you think could really make an impact across all of those realms you mentioned?
Well, I've been at this for a while. I started my career at NASA. I was a deputy project scientist for a mission called the Global Precipitation Mission. I'm now at the University of Georgia. And so the good news, bad news, the bad news first is that yes, climate is changing and extreme weather is a problem for us. But the good news, I actually am the eternal optimist. We have the technology. We know what to do on the observational side, on the mitigation and adaptation side, on the resiliency side. We just have to have the will to do it and get over the climate delayism that's at play because of discussions about how much it's going to cost and who this and that. But the things that excite me most are sort of new renewable. I was talking with a colleague that's here in the audience from Dominion Energy. I don't see certain people as different sort of stakeholders. We're all in this game, and he was talking about how they're moving into more renewable energy sources. So that's kind of the low-hanging fruit. We know where we need to go in those spaces with wind and solar and nuclear even. But there are also new technologies in terms of, for example, one of the things that I've been involved in with at the University of Georgia, we're thinking about ways to take heat that cities produce, the urban heat island, repurpose or redistribute that heat. We know that there's technology that can do that. But in terms of the observational side, and we're here talking at Tomorrow I/O, so there are new capabilities. So one of the things that we need to improve is our long-term data record so that we can detect and monitor the change. You've got to have a long-term record of things like precipitation, sea level, and so forth. You have to have improved modeling capacity. Most of our models, when I was in grad school, were very coarse. They didn't get down at the scale of a city or a county. But now with some of the new observations that are coming from the federal space, people like NASA, NOAA, but also private sector, that's the new part, Tomorrow I/O. New capabilities with small sat, CubeSat capabilities that are providing some of these measurements in ways that we never envisioned and faster. You know, there's a place for both. I grew up in an era at the AMS where there was sometimes a tension between the federal space and the private sector, but now we all play in the same sandbox.
Got it.
And so federal government can do some things better, and the private sector can do some things better, faster and quicker, and take more risk. And so this ecosystem is emerging, and so we're going to need that partnership because this is a big challenge. It's not going to be solved by one sector.
Perfect transition. I was just about to say, we've heard you talk about collaboration a lot. You just touched on public-private partnerships. Are there any examples maybe of public-private partnerships that you feel like are really working well right now between the two sectors that we need to do more of?
I think there are, and I won't get into any specifics, but there are several agreements in place now between, say, NOAA, NESDIS, the National Weather Service, where they're doing data buys from private companies. So yes, we still have GOES and JPSS and various satellites in low orbit and geosynchronous orbit, but there are places where the federal government has said, okay, I need that sort of precipitable water or occultation data. Let's buy it on a data buy scenario. So I think that's working well. Quiet is kept. There's always, and this is a narrative I want to shatter a little bit, there's actually always been a public-private partnership. I spent 12 years of my career at NASA, late 90s into the early 2000s. At NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, where I was, most of the people were private contractors on that space center. I was a civil servant, but many of the people that supported that effort, designed the satellite, did much of the research, were working for various private companies. So there's always been that private interaction, but it has evolved in such a way that now companies like Tomorrow.io can be data providers or data partners for the agencies.
Makes sense. And speaking of across sectors, resilience, you've said it, we're talking about it, we're a resilience platform. Of course, it's in our branding a lot. It's a word that's coming up more and more, both on the private and public side.
Yeah.
Why do you think now this concept of resiliency is so important? And maybe to go further, what does it mean to you?
So resilience actually is one of those words that means different things to different people, because you can talk about resiliency in terms of a bridge's resiliency to an ice storm or heat expansion or so forth. Or you can talk about resiliency. We're sitting here in New Orleans, all right? New Orleans was recently hit by Hurricane Ida several years ago, and Katrina before that. Everyone was exposed. Certain people have sensitivity, but resiliency can be defined as who has the ability to bounce back. And some of us have the ability to bounce back. If hurricanes approaching us today, I've got the means to get my family and go inland 100 miles to a hotel if I need to. Many people don't. So that's a moniker of resiliency as well. But I think in terms of this broader discussion about resiliency and where organizations like yours can help, is that we need a national conversation and framework around resiliency. I think Pew recently published some work looking at various states and their resiliency grades, and they were graded from A to F. And so I think there were buzzwords out there on adaptation, mitigation, sustainability, but I think we need to have a national conversation about a sort of a clear understanding what we all mean by resiliency in a larger term space and how we get there.
Makes total sense. And to go deeper, maybe why now? Is it just that weather volatility finally
Why
is reaching
now?
everyone? Yeah.
You know why now. Come on, we're seeing Hurricane Helene and dipole weather events causing wildfires in California like I've never seen. And I know you're being facetious there. But the reality is, I am not, if anybody has followed my career, I'm not an alarmist. I'm not hyperbolic. I can't even say that word today, hyperbolic. But the reality is, we're seeing things that I've been in this field. I'm not the most senior person walking this hall, but I've been around long enough to know that I haven't seen anything like what we've seen in California. I haven't seen anything like what I just saw with Hurricane Helene. I have rarely seen anything like those floods I saw in Spain last year. So we're seeing a different type of event. I co-authored a report recently for the National Academies. And one of the things that we found in that report is that people have benchmarks in their mind. Oh, I remember Hurricane so-and-so, or I remember that heat wave, or I remember that flood. Those aren't representative of this weather anymore. And that's important because it informs how they make decisions at the local household level, but also even stakeholders and decision makers within government, because they may have a reference point of a Katrina or a Harvey, but a Helene might be something very different. And so we need to adjust our resiliency framework to understand that it's a bit dated. I'll give you one more example since we're in New Orleans. There's a contraflow or counterflow process whereby her decision makers in places like New Orleans need like 3 days, 72 hours to make a decision about a uniform evacuation and reverse the flow on interstates. We're in an era where hurricanes are rapidly intensifying. We may not have 3 days. That storm might be a Cat 1 when you go to bed, and it's Cat 3 when you wake up. So we need a paradigm shift in terms of our decision-making process and our resiliency frameworks.
I like the phrase resiliency frameworks. Can you talk about vision of Dr. Marshall Shepard's future resiliency framework? What does that look like as weather gets worse?
Oh, I think I would need to think a little bit more about that. We'd have to bring in stakeholders and partners. But I will say this, I'm a part of the Institute for Resilient Infrastructure System, or IRIS, at the University of Georgia. And we stood that institute up at the University of Georgia. It's got climate scientists, weather experts, engineers, anthropologists, economists, and so forth. It's a multidisciplinary center that was stood up to actually think about that very questions.
Very cool. Okay. And as you walk around, you mentioned you're the eternal optimist, which I love. What conversations are exciting you the most? You're talking to job seekers. Also, I know a lot of university students. Like, what's the next generation? What gets you really, really feeling positive and excited?
Well, the next generation, what gets me feeling positive is I talk about this often. I did a TED Talk several years ago, and I talk about marinades. So we marinate our meat and our vegetables, and they take on the flavor of that marinade. Well, we've all been soaking all of our lives in different cultural, racial, geographic, political, religious marinades. And that actually shapes how we view things like science and approaches. What excites me about the younger generation is they haven't been soaking as long. So they are not as biased in sort of some of these marinades. And so they understand, irrespective of their political viewpoint or their religious belief, that there's a crisis at hand and it really impacts us all. So I'm around students every day at a university, and I see that optimism. There's not as much sort of deep-rooted bias based on where I come from or what I believe or who I worship. So.
I like the way you said that.
Yeah.
Not as haven't marinated as long. Fascinating. It's awesome.
Yep.
Great. I know we only have a small group, but does anyone have questions as we've talked that sparked for you?
I have one.
Yeah, please.
Could you expound on that? I think you mentioned briefly a resiliency score. People like to see things in green, yellow, and
Yeah,
red,
this
you
would
know,
exactly.
color things to help them understand better what they're facing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the question was about resiliency scores, and to say a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm.
So Pew actually is an organization that does these types of things, and if you actually just do a little quick Google on Pew's resiliency grades or framework, they haven't done a color code of red, yellow, green, but they've actually given grades. They've taken us back to school, and so A, B, C, D, E, and F. So well, I guess there's no E, but yes, so they've given grades to different organizations, different states. So I'd invite you all, and it's a little bit harrowing actually how many people fell below the curve in terms of adequate resiliency scores. And so I think it's not a surprise to many of us. I think people actually talk about resiliency and things of that nature, but there's been no sort of systematic effort or framework to think about it. I think over the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be critical. And again, I know there are different political discussions and viewpoints out there, but the people that live in North Carolina just know that I-40 washed out during Hurricane Helene. And so when they build it back, are we going to build it back differently? It's a simple question. It's no brainer.
Makes sense. Anything else that you want to talk about on the resiliency
No,
side?
I just want to say that, as I was walking around the exhibit hall where we're coming from today, it's really interesting to see. I've been coming to AMS since the early 90s. The sort of proliferation of the private sector in this hall. I mean, they've always been there, but it was instrument companies like little thermometers and spectrometers and things like that. But I mean, the proliferation of just the private sector that's present today illustrates the transition that we alluded to earlier in this need. Again, it's an all hands on deck challenge. And it's not just climate change. It's things like improving weather forecasting. How do we best integrate AI into a weather intelligence framework, which is, I know, something that Tomorrow I/O is also very focused on. I mean, I've kind of been sort of talking from the perspective of your remote sensing capabilities, but I know you have a weather platform, and in a past, I've talked to many of your colleagues and sort of leaders about sort of the evolution of this company. So I remember when you were Climacell. So so I've definitely sort of kept my ear to the ground. I've advised this company at times, and so I don't have any sort of stake in any particular company, but it's just important to see this public-private partnership continue to grow.
Definitely.
Yep.
If you had to say all hands on deck approach, as you said, like what's the biggest opportunity in the next year, 3 years, 5 years for private public partnerships in this realm?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to sort of, first of all, let me say this, and some people agree with me on this, some people disagree. I do believe that public weather information is the backbone. Just like if my house catches on fire, I want to know that the fire department's coming. But I think that I'm very strongly supportive of the federal weather infrastructure. But I think there are things that the private sector can do faster and better and innovate. And so I hope we continue to create mechanisms and reduce barriers to making that happen.
Definitely. Well, it's a nice place to end. Dr. Shepard, thank you so much for joining
Thank you
us
for
today.
having me.
Always happy to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.